I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Varuna Prakash. She's an engineer turned doctor, currently in her second year of internal medicine residency at the University of Toronto. She previously worked in the field of human factors engineering and healthcare, interning for the World Health Organization and Massachusetts General Hospital, among other local institutions. Here to tell us more about her self-described scenic route through engineering and medicine is Varuna Prakash. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here, thrilled to see so many excited faces in the audience. So when I was thinking about what I could talk to you guys about today, I asked myself the question, what would current Varuna say to the Varuna who was at your age and your stage of life, looking ahead to making big career decisions? And I thought of basically two things. So first is, Varuna, don't spend so much time on the Backstreet Boys versus NSYNC battle. That is not worth your time. And very true, years later. The second is, Varuna, you are going to become an engineer, you're going to become a doctor, you're going to travel the world, you're going to publish papers, you're going to win awards, you're going to do everything that you wanted to do, and you're going to end up feeling this deep sense of professional fulfillment all the way down to the tips of your toes. You're going to get there, but it's not going to happen in the nice, linear, beautiful, straight path that your guidance counselor told you about in grade 12. Instead, it's going to look a little bit like this. So a lot of twists, a lot of turns in the road, a lot of doubling back, a lot of mistakes. There's going to be failure. There's going to be uncertainty. There's going to be a huge sensation of feeling really, really lost at multiple points. And that's okay. That's totally fine because you'll still get there. That is what I would have told myself when I was in your shoes, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm going to tell you about where I grew up, where I've been, what I'm up to now, what I'm looking ahead to the future, and I hope that these little pearls of wisdom will help you as you start your own little careers, or big careers, I hope, in STEM fields. So let's go back a little bit of the Wayback Playback machine here. This was me as a kid in 1998, way before you guys were born. And I was a kid growing up in India, and that's how I spent most of my time. So my nose was always in a book, my head was in the clouds, and I spent all of my time lost in fantasy. I loved words, I loved literature, I loved to read. I really didn't like math. In fact, I was terrible at it. I didn't really love science. And I thought I wanted to be a journalist, or I wanted to be an author of some sort. I wanted to be a British author, very specifically. And I had no idea what any of those things meant. But certainly becoming an engineer and becoming a doctor was never on my radar. And I say this to you because I think we dichotomize ourselves really early. So we separate ourselves into left brain versus right brain, or artist versus scientist, or creative versus technical, when really we all contain multitudes, and we can carry those multiple parts of ourselves into our future lives and our future careers very easily. So my parents moved around a lot, and because of their jobs, we moved with them. So I moved to a different city every 3 years of my life. And that meant every 3 years I was starting at a new school, I was making new friends, I was getting to know a new place. And that was really cool and really exciting, but it was also pretty tough as a kid, as you might imagine. This photo here is from Hong Kong, which is where I moved when I was 11 years old. And somewhere in the middle of all those moves, I skipped a couple grades. So I was 11 years old in grade 8. I was 2 years younger than everyone else. I felt like I was 5 years behind on puberty. I was socially awkward. I was shy. I had no self-esteem. And I'm not saying these things so that you feel sorry for me. I'm saying them because if you've been there, and if this has been your experience, I totally feel you. I was there. And I promise you that it gets better. It does. It really does. It gets better. But the reason I also say this is because just to give you a sense of how school became my refuge. So I threw myself into my work. I loved school. I loved studying. I loved classwork. And the reason was that it became my safe space. And it became a space with no judgment. And the only expectations I ever had to live up to were my own. And that's how I really started loving the sciences. I started loving math. I started loving every subject that I could get my hands on. So long story short, we moved on from Hong Kong, we moved to Toronto. I finished high school here. And once again, I was faced with this question of what to do with my life. I was in the same shoes that many of you here today are, which is trying to figure out what to apply for in university. And one of the stressors about growing up, moving every couple of years, is you don't really have a lot of time to figure out what you want to do, because you're spending a lot of time just trying to stay afloat and trying to integrate into every new setting that you find yourself in. So, and I was an immigrant, so I had no role models or mentors or speed mentoring sessions where people could point me in any particular direction. So I employed the tried and true shotgun approach to applying to university. So I applied to journalism, I applied to life sciences, I applied to something called space science, I'm not sure exactly what that is, and I applied to engineering. And I managed to get into engineering science at the University of Toronto. And back then, and I think possibly even now, that was one of sort of the really competitive engineering programs to try to get into. I had no idea what an engineer was. I had no idea what a job in engineering looked like. And I decided, hey, this looks like it's really hard, and I can always switch into something easier, so here we go. I don't recommend, don't do as I do. I don't recommend that approach to university education. But that's what I did, and that's the program I started. So I started at engineering science, and I started off my first day with a lot of excitement, as all of you will have on your first day of university. And unfortunately, things didn't go as I had hoped. So I thought long and hard before putting this slide up here. And I see some laughs in here and some ooh. Yeah, that's how bad it was. I felt like I showed up on day one and I was 6 weeks behind. I felt like the subject matter was so theoretical, and I'm a very practical person, so it wasn't a great fit for me. I had no idea what was going on. I felt like I was drinking from a fire hose every single day of that year, and I just couldn't keep up. It sucked. It was disastrous. And these were my grades. This is a photocopy or a screenshot of my transcript, and I've never had C's and D's on my transcript before, so this was a huge shocker for me. I felt like a complete failure. I felt a deep sense of shame. I felt like I'd let myself down, let my family down. I'd let down everybody who had these great expectations of me. And it's interesting, even today when I post this here and I talk to you about this, I feel this sort of red-hot sense of shame bubbling up in my chest, and if I could crawl underneath the stage and run away, I would. But looking back in retrospect, having this failure and having it so early on in my career was probably the best thing that could have happened to me. It's going to happen to all of you guys, maybe not in the same way, but every person in this room who has an established career has experienced a failure of some sort, whether it's grades, whether it's something personal, you name it. Everyone has experienced failure. And the act of going through and contending with those emotions of shame and picking yourself up and moving on is something that you can't learn. You just have to go through it. And having gone through this so early on was absolutely monumental to the rest of my professional development, and I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't failed so spectacularly back then. So what did I do? I took the summer off to recuperate and reconnect with my thoughts and figure out what I really wanted to do, and I ended up switching into materials engineering. And I started the fall again at the University of Toronto in my second year of materials engineering, and it was way, way better. This time, the material was practical. I loved the content. I became drawn to biomaterials and biomedical engineering, which exposed me for the first time to healthcare. And the work of working on problems and solutions that directly improved people's health and improved people's lives and improved our healthcare system was such a big motivator for me. As I started getting more passionate about the work, my grades got better, my social life improved. Suddenly, it became really easy over the next 3 years to keep up with school and to enjoy what I was doing. I felt passion for the first time. I ended up graduating near the top of my class through materials engineering, not because I had substantially changed and not because I magically gained 50 IQ points over the last year, but just because I simply loved what I did way more. At the end of my materials engineering undergrad, I once again had some difficult decisions to make. So I realized I was really drawn to healthcare, and materials was wonderful, but I wasn't sure if it was the right field for me. I wanted to be working somewhere where I could connect with people and I could work on healthcare problems. And I didn't know if I wanted to go into the workforce or if I wanted to get a PhD or if I wanted to do something else entirely. And once again, I had a lot of uncertainty and I was pretty lost, and I did the whole shotgun approach one more time. So I got into a PhD program in the States, and then I made a backup application for a master's in biomedical clinical engineering here in Toronto. And I remember this moment distinctly. 15 minutes before my decision was due, I declined my PhD offer and decided to go all into the healthcare option. And I have never turned back. Since that moment, I have been thriving. I love my work. Healthcare drew me, it intrigued me. The problems were complicated and complex, and there were so many of them. And my skills were put to excellent use in various healthcare settings. This began the part of my life that I call the yes and era, because I said yes to every opportunity that came by. Again, not very wise, but in the formative stages of your career, actually a really good thing. I applied for and got an internship at the Massachusetts General Hospital, so I gave up my apartment, I free-cycled all my possessions on Craigslist, and I moved to Boston. And I did this internship at Mass Gen where I was exposed to technical challenges I had never thought of before. I emailed someone at the World Health Organization and asked them if they might have an internship for me. I never expected they would say yes. 6 weeks later, I get a reply in the email saying, yes, can you start next month? So I get a 70-liter backpack and throw some clothes in there, and I move to Geneva, to Switzerland, and I start an internship at the World Health Organization. The internship itself, not great. The organization was in a lot of chaos. There was a lot of conflict. My boss ended up losing her job. So for me, the work itself wasn't super productive. But it didn't matter because the experience was phenomenal. So I spent every hour of the day that I could attending talks, everything from plague to SARS to TB to vaccination programs. And these talks expanded my worldview beyond anything I could have hoped for. I spent my weekends traveling around Europe and meeting people from every walk of life. And that's learning I couldn't get anywhere at university. It was one of the best times of my life. I came back to Toronto and I took on a full-time job at the Centre for Global eHealth Innovation, which is a really unique place located out of a hospital, the Toronto General Hospital, where they solve some of healthcare's most wicked problems with technology. So I was working on medical devices and trying to improve their usability, trying to make them safer for doctors and nurses and patients to use. And I loved every moment of it. This picture here is an app called BANT, which is an app for young adults with type 1 diabetes to manage their blood sugars better. A very old cell phone, obviously, but now this app is actually in use. It's being trialed, and it's being used by hundreds of adolescents with type 1 diabetes, fully integrated with their glucometers and other pieces of home medical technology. So this was fascinating. And at this point, having spent a couple of years working in the human factors business, in the medical technology business, I realized I wanted something more. I loved my work in engineering, but I wanted to be one-on-one with patients. I realized I wanted to provide direct patient care, and I wanted to be the leader of a healthcare team while bringing in my experience with medical technologies. I wanted to be able to generate problems from the clinical environment that I saw, and then using my skills as an engineer to solve those problems. Around this time, one of my mentors gave me this great quote: "If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there." So up until now, I'd been kind of meandering, I'd been kind of lost, I'd been falling into things more so out of chance rather than out of purpose. And around this time when I was working in this position, I took the time to actually sit down and think about not a job description, not a place of employment, but to think about what my values were and to think about what I actually wanted to do with my time. And all roads at this point led me towards applying to medical school, and that's exactly what I did. So applying to med school in Canada, as you may have heard, sometimes feels like trying to win the lottery. It's a very, very competitive environment. And I had that albatross around my neck of those horrible grades from first-year engineering that you saw before. But if anyone tells you it's impossible, don't believe them. There's always a way, especially if you've done things to overcome your failures, if you've done other productive things like internships, like jobs, like publications. If you've done other things and moved past your failures, they will not come back to haunt you for the rest of your life, which is what I was worried about. I joined medical school in 2013 at the University of Toronto, and I haven't looked back since. This is a photo of my ID badge from residency. So I'm currently an internal medicine physician, resident physician, and I'm working towards a career potentially in critical care or intensive care. And I love this picture because the badge on the left is me on my first day of residency. And I just look terrified, like I don't know what I've gotten myself into. And the badge on the right is me on my first day of my second year of residency. I'm a senior medical resident at this point. I'm a little delirious because I haven't slept in 26 hours. I pulled a night shift on this one. But I'm happy. I'm thrilled because I finally found the type of work that I love to do. And I feel that deep sense of contentment all the way down to my toes. This hasn't been without its challenges. So medicine is an all-encompassing field. It's 10 years of really hard work at minimum. It's 10 years of working really, really long hours, being away from your family, trying to combat burnout at every step of the way. It's 10 years of physically grueling work and emotionally demanding work. But it's also a field that I can't imagine myself doing anything but. I love it for the autonomy that you get. I love it for the complexity of the problems that you get to diagnose and manage. I love that I can control my time and I can bring in other aspects of my identity, like teaching, like being a teacher, like being an investigator, being a researcher, being a scientist, being an engineer, being an entrepreneur. I can combine all of that with my clinical practice. And most of all, I feel really, really fulfilled in my role as a physician providing direct patient care. So I'm absolutely in the right place, despite getting really, really lost at multiple points along the way. So I'm going to close by just reading you a short quote by one of my favorite feminist authors, Rebecca Solnit. And she has written this great book that I recommend to you. It's called A Field Guide to Getting Lost. And everything I've described for you today is about me getting lost at a lot of key forks in the road and still making it through okay. And Rebecca Solnit describes being lost as actually being something beautiful and being something productive and enabling discovery. And she says, not to know how to get lost brings you to destruction, and somewhere in the terra incognita in between lies a life of discovery. And this I find really true right down to this day. So I'll end it there. I'm happy to take questions. I wish you all the best on your own adventures, and I hope you get a little bit lost along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Varuna. Again, if you have questions, please come up to the mic and form a line. But I had a question that I wanted to ask you about your talk. When you were in engineering and you said you had this desire to go into healthcare, or you were thinking about the PhD versus the master's program, was there anything that inspired you to be interested in healthcare? How did you, what sparked your interest in the field?
Yeah, I remember the exact moment. So one summer I did a short internship at a hospital at Princess Margaret, which is a famous oncology hospital in downtown Toronto. And I worked on a project on radiation therapy for patients with cancer. And it was my first time being in a hospital environment and looking at how technologies played a role in the hospital environment and how patients got care through those technologies. And that was probably the first time I was exposed to direct patient care, and I loved it. And that's what made me switch paths.
Awesome. All right. Oh, we do have a question. Come on up.
Hi, my name's Annabella, and I'm from KCI in town.
Hello.
And you spoke a little bit about how when you were younger you were interested in arts and science, like literature. And I was wondering if how you balance those interests, and if like you still do something related to those, like childhood interests in like writing or things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I grew up writing throughout my childhood. So through elementary school, through high school, I wrote for multiple student newspapers. I carried that on through undergrad engineering as well. It's actually quite easy to write and publish if you're motivated and passionate to do it, because you have self-publishing platforms and you will always have an audience if you want to. I find the harder thing is to actually find the time and the discipline to write purposefully. So when I have to admit, in medicine and through residency, I've kind of taken down the creative aspect a little bit. I've gone dark on the creative writing front, mostly because my time has to be devoted towards more technical forms of writing or the medical and clinical work itself. But I do, I journal quite a bit, and I've started using my journal as motivation for more creative pieces. I haven't published any of those creative pieces yet, but that's just a matter of time and sort of discipline, not so much any other barriers. So absolutely there's a way to do it. And I have a number of colleagues who publish creative writing in medical and non-medical journals while going through residency. So if it's a priority, you absolutely can make it happen.